In a flurry of AI developments, President Trump recently signed an executive order on, quote, woke AI. The order prohibits the federal government from procuring AI models that fail to pursue objective truth and, The order prohibits the federal government from procuring AI models that fail to pursue objective truth and espouse DEI-related values. Critics have compared the law to the sort of ideological tests imposed by the Chinese government on its own models. Advocates regard it as an overdue check on a tech sector that seems increasingly willing to advance specific views on controversial cultural questions. While we wait for further guidance from the OMB, GSA, and OSTP, we're fortunate to have Renée and Alan sort through the EO, its legality, and its likely effects on AI development. There is so much to unpack, just starting with what the heck woke AI even means. But Alan, let's go to you and just get a sense of the text of the EO itself. What is this EO? What are its core provisions? What does it say?
Yeah, it's a doozy. So the EO, it's called Preventing Woke AI in the Federal Government, and it's one of the three EOs that were released in conjunction with the AI Action Plan that we've covered, obviously, a ton on Lawfare and on scaling laws. So So this is a rich text, let's put it that way. And I actually want to start with how it was written, because I think it actually says a lot before we get into the substance of it. So like many EOs, there is a kind of section 1 preamble purpose, and then there's the actual stuff that matters. Now, usually in most EOs, those two are in some ways related, right? And in this EO, they are as if written by two entirely different people. Now, I have no inside information, but I actually suspect that's exactly what happened. Where the section 1 purpose is this like full-throated right-wing MAGA culture war, statement about wokeness and DEI and the evils of transgenderism. I mean, literally, right? Like, and on and on and on and on. It's kind of what you'd expect. It's like reasonably offensive. And if that's what the EO was, that'd be a huge problem. But then you actually read sections 2 through 5, and those are much more normal, soberly written EOs, to the point where it's almost as if the rest of the EO was written to kind of quarantine section 1. So, for example, section 1 is all about the evils of DEI, and it gives like some examples of what it thinks DEI is. But then section 2, which is the definition section, doesn't define DEI, which is very odd, because if the point of this order is to eliminate wokeness and DEI from federally procured AI models, like you would think that section 2 would have to define that, but it doesn't.
It doesn't define woke either.
It doesn't define woke, right?
Either, yeah.
Right? So why is that? Again, I'm like deep tea reading leaves, but I think it's because the point of whoever actually like wrote this EO was to like satisfy the kind of internal MAGA audience in section 1, and then immediately forget about it in the actual operative provisions of the rest of the EO. Now, like the rest of the EO, obviously, like it's not uncontroversial, but I think it's a much more good faith attempt to deal with what is at least a perceived problem, and we can talk about the reality or not reality of that problem. And basically it says that there are these two quote-unquote unbiased AI principles that all federally procured AI models have to abide by. And I should emphasize, this only applies to federally procured AI models. So in the run-up to this EO, there was some concern that it was going to apply to, or that it was going to limit procurement from AI companies based on any model that the AI company creates, including public-facing ones. And that would have been a huge deal.
So just to make that clear, so you're saying, Alan, if I'm OpenAI and I have a slew of 5 different models.
Yes, if you have woke GPT that you are selling to the public.
Woke GPT, and then I have, traditional family values GPT.
Exactly.
And then I have the GPT I'm offering to the federal government. We're only caring about the latter GPT.
Exactly. At least within this EO. I mean, who knows how the hell the procurement actually works, but we're just focusing on the EO. And so there are these two unbiased AI principles. One is that the model must be, quote, truth-seeking, and the other must be that it must be, quote, ideologically neutral. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot of detail about what those two are. But what's interesting is that then there are actually, in section 3, in section 4, a lot of exceptions to this, which is actually hugely important. So there are all sorts of carve-outs for technical feasibility and national security. And then there's even a carve-out for the ideological neutrality exception, or the ideological neutrality requirement, rather, where it says that one way to satisfy ideological neutrality is to simply disclose to the user what your internal system prompt is. So just as a reminder, when a user interacts with a chatbot, they enter in some user prompt, tell me a story about, X. But what actually happens is that user input is combined with a system prompt, often a very, very long, detailed kind of additional gloss that the AI developer wants the AI model to take into account. Those two things are then combined to create the output. And this has created some issues. So, for example, we all remember last year's "quote unquote" woke Gemini debacle, when you would ask Gemini for give me a picture of George Washington, and you would get like a racially diverse George Washington or a racially diverse group of like Nazi soldiers. And the reason for this was because the system prompt was a very ham-fisted, always be diverse, basically, when you are doing output. And sometimes that's fine, sometimes that's not so fine. So it turns out that if you just disclose to the user what your system prompt is, you're ideologically neutral. Now that's really interesting, and we can talk about like what that means for researchers and transparency. I kind of love this, but it really takes a lot of the sting, I think, out of the ideological neutrality requirement. So again, I think you can still totally be against this on principle, but this is so much different than the sort of section 1, like full-throated MAGA preamble has. Again, we'll have to see. I think a lot of the devil's going to be in the details of the OMB guidance, which the executive order gives OMB 120 days to implement. Yeah, certainly relative to expectations, this exceeded them, at least for me, and I think actually for a lot of people. But I've been talking for a while. I'm very curious what Renée thinks.
Happy summer to the OMB folks who have 120 days to think through this EO.
And also
many other things.
And also, I should say, also to, I assume, many of the policy councils at all of these AI companies that are like calling whoever the hell they know at OMB and being like, okay, here's how here's what we can do and we can't do.
Yeah, that'll be fun to FOIA later. But Renée, for the kind of implications of these operative terms, I think a question for a lot of listeners who haven't taken con law from Professor Rozenshtein may be, what's the teeth of this executive order? What happens if a company just doesn't want to comply, or what sort of avenues can a lab take with respect to this EO to either dodge compliance or perhaps finagle their way around sort of these provisions?
Well, so I think the question is, I was joking around about it with somebody else I was reading it with, saying it's sort of the, ignore all prior instructions. Like that's the
that's so good.
The second half of the EO and the first half.
That's really good.
The sort of dynamic that's happening with the system prompt. One of the ways that you can see it happening dynamically for people who want a little bit more maybe tangible explanation. If we think about some of the notorious examples, there's the Google Gemini situation, which is referenced up at the top of the EO. That is the example of the the Asian Nazis and I think the Black founding fathers, and there were a few of these sort of screw ups that Google had when that was about 2 years ago now, if I'm not mistaken. That actually kind of inspired Elon to create XAI. He actually kind of comes out and says it. I wrote a Substack post about it. The history of it is sort of interesting and Google actually, the executives call him to explain what happened because he is so outraged about it on X. He then, of course, has his own.
Yeah, XAI goes super smoothly. Grok is just no issues. 10 out of 10, right. No notes.
And I was actually, as you were talking, Alan, trying to pull up Grok's system prompt because they do publish it transparently, which I'll give them credit for that piece of it. That's the transparency element, because they had this situation happen maybe 3 weeks ago now, where Grok had a sort of system prompt situation happen where it was instructed not to, quote, shy away from making claims which are politically incorrect as long as they are well substantiated. That's a quote from the system prompt, and a few of these other things, maximally based, these sorts of things where the end result of it winds up being this thing, starting to call itself Mecha Hitler and go down some.
Look, who among us has not, in a moment of enthusiasm, called ourselves Mecha Hitler?
So you wind up though again with this question of like the situation of like what is the base model. model doing versus what is happening with the experience that you have engaging with the chatbot. And again, you can see the different system prompts for the various agents versus what happens when you engage with Grok in the sort of way in which you can engage with the chatbot, not in its at Grok form on Twitter. So there's different ways in which you can engage with the model versus the various prompts and system prompts layers that are kind of added on top. So I think you have this dynamic happening where users can see, I think, and the Gemini Asian Nazis and then Grok becoming a Nazi, people can see just what happens when system prompts steer AI in such a way that it becomes very visceral. It becomes a big story, and they can see what happens when an AI is directed to act in a certain way. And so I think it becomes clear to the public that there are some stakes here, there are some costs here, and that is where you have seen both on the right and on the left this concern that an AI can be biased in a particular way, can act in a certain direction. And that's where this question of what should the government contract with is something that is not inherently a bad thing to ask, right? This is where I don't think that an AI, an executive order saying we want a maximally truth-seeking AI, or an AI that is looking to scientific evidence, an AI that is trying to get at evidentiary facts. And just to be clear, also Grok in its kind of earlier incarnations before that system prompt update actually did quite a good job fact-checking, which is one of the reasons why Elon got mad at it. That's the sort of irony of what happened with that system prompt update. So there is this dynamic where people have come to rely on these things, and as you have this executive order coming out of the Trump administration, I don't think that there's an inherently the second half of the EO is not bad. It sort of overrides what happened, ignore all prior instructions in the first. The question is, what does that do does that steer the model developers to develop in a particular direction? And this takes us back into the realm of the law, which is Alan's expertise, not mine, which is, does this lead companies to shift training data, to shift the development of their base models in any particular way, as opposed to shifting what happens with their agents and the things that are layered on top of them?
Yeah, can I just respond to that quickly? Yeah, I think that is the $64 million question, or I guess it's AI, so it's the $64 trillion question, I guess, at the scales we're talking about. I think the answer is probably no for a couple of reasons. And again, I'm not a machine learning engineer, so I'd be very curious if I get this wrong. Please yell at me on X and Blue Sky about this. I think it's going to be very hard to do this at a base model level for a couple of reasons. First, I think the EO, part of the reason is because the EO provides this huge out, right? It's just so much easier just to be transparent about your system prompt. And obviously there may be some proprietary reasons why you might not want to do that, but it's becoming, I think, more sort of culturally mainstream to be more transparent. Grok does it they just have a GitHub repo where they do this. Anthropic does this really well. And there's going to be the other companies will be shamed into doing this basically. And now there's this incentive to do so. But the other, and I think more fundamental reason is because, you only have so much control over base model training. At the end of the day, right, you're ingesting the entire internet, the entire corpus of human knowledge, and doing next token prediction. And obviously there are different ways of doing that. But one really interesting finding in the literature, as I at least understand it, is that as these models get bigger and bigger and bigger, they're all kind of converging to the same model, right? Because they're all just kind of doing next token prediction on all of human knowledge. And there are certain commonalities, right? Which this raises super interesting philosophical questions about, the convergence on truth and values and stuff like that. And that's an interesting question. But it also just means that it's much harder to steer at the base model level. And it's certainly, and the more detailed the more specific of an outcome you're trying to get at, the harder it is to steer. Right? If you're trying to eliminate quote unquote DEI from a base model, or you're trying to bake in DEI to a base model, that is just very hard to do if you're dealing with, 100 petabytes of information. How are you going to do that? So it's much easier to do at the system prompt level. And what's nice about that is you can have different systems. That's easy to swap in and out. You can sell just different system prompts to different users at fairly low cost, and then you can publicize that. So, I suspect that this will not have the sort of effect on models generally. And that's kind of another reason why I suspect that there's not going to be too much legal issues. Because, and again, I'm sure we can talk about the legal issues more in detail later. If the effect of this procurement was that it was going to also have huge spillover effects onto how the models communicate with general users, then you could make a kind of like effects-based First Amendment argument. But if it's not, and I don't think it's going to, then it becomes even harder to say this has some sort of spillover First Amendment problem.
Well, and I think it's pointing out that even when we look at models like OpenAI's recent model that suffered from sycophancy, obviously it wasn't hoping to develop a model that had these sycophantic tendencies of saying, yes, Kevin, your legal analysis is better than Alan's. But having that sort of characteristic baked in was something that they then had to go and work really hard to take out. And so this is definitely in some instances more of an art than a science. And to your point, Renee, I think what stands out to me is this is going to require some degree of engineering time that could have otherwise been spent doing other things that perhaps are pushing out the frontier of AI or developing new tools or developing more models in a different approach. But
I think it's the alignment, like alignment and fine tuning is where I've seen some of the First Amendment concerns articulated. Like where is the sort of values bacon? And I am not 100% sure where the federal contracts piece connects at that point. That's the part where I don't have a strong knowledge base. So I'm sure someone will tell me on Blue Sky.
I got you. I got you.
So let's go there, Alan. I think it's important to flag for folks that there's no First Amendment right to get a contract with the government, right? You're not guaranteed, or none of us have equal access to say my company should be first and foremost operating with the government. So that adds a bit of weird context and color to this debate around what can the government say with respect to procuring a specific good or service. We've seen the government should have standards, right? It wants a weapon of a certain capability, or it wants a good that's gone through certain standards. So how does that change our legal analysis of the government saying we want a certain kind of AI that maybe has certain flavors and characteristics?
Yes. So you are correct that you don't have a First Amendment right to a government contract, but you do have a right to getting a government contract without your First Amendment rights being violated. And so the question is, where is that line, right? Where is that line? So before we get into a procurement, we should talk about sort of the more fundamental principle here, which is the idea of government speech, which is that the government has its own right to speak. And when the government speaks, it is allowed to have a viewpoint, right? Elections have consequences, right? Like the government is not required to be viewpoint neutral in its own speech. A corollary of that is that when the government purchases things for its own use, right, it is allowed to not do so in a viewpoint neutral way. It is allowed to say, I want this thing and not that thing, right, for my own use. It's even allowed to fund certain people to speak in certain ways and not other ways. So a famous example, probably the most famous Supreme Court case about this, is this case from 1991 called Rust versus Sullivan. And this was a case about, as so many cases are in common law, about abortion and reproductive rights. And this was a case about whether the government could only provide funds to like family planning providers that did not also provide abortions. And provide abortions, and this is why it's a First Amendment case, was defined very broadly, not just actually providing the medical abortion procedures, but also providing family counseling services that included abortion counseling, right? Now, that itself is a First Amendment protected activity, right? So if you're a doctor or a nurse or whatever, and you want to advise a patient on how to procure an abortion or whether abortion is right for them, that is First Amendment protected speech. So the government cannot, for example, say, you cannot provide, you cannot counsel a patient about abortion, though. Before everyone jumps at me in the chats, there's a bunch of complicated case law around there. But there certainly is a First Amendment issue. So the question was, well, if that's First Amendment protected, does the government then have to fund you, provider, to provide those, to do that, engage in that First Amendment speech, if it's also providing sort of similar people to not engage in that speech? And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, this is a contested decision, said no. right? The government is allowed to not fund necessarily speech that it does not like. Now, again, as in all First Amendment cases, the devil's in the kind of the details and the blurry lines. So there are that principle should not be taken too far. There are other cases that make very clear that government contractors still have government employees, and that includes government contractors, which is the key here, still have their own First Amendment rights. So there are lots of cases where the government says, for example, there's one case, for example, where the government tried to not fund lawyers who would also then advocate against certain other government laws. And the government said, no, you can't do that because that's their own different speech. There's another case where I think it was a PEPFAR case, the AIDS prevention policy that's been so effective and has since been quite controversially tried to be cut by DOJ and stuff. But there was a case in the early 2000s where the government tried to condition PEPFAR funds on the condition that the organization would also promote abstinence. And the court said, no, you can't do that, right? Because that's separate speech, right? Now, again, the reason this is tricky is because money is fungible, right? And that's the government's argument has always been, where, because money is fungible, we should be able to impose pretty restrictive conditions on entities that take our money, because otherwise, they can just use our money for one thing, and then the money that, money's fungible, right? But the courts have sort of held the line there. So sorry, that's a very long wind up. But I'm a First Amendment, but I'm a con law professor, and this is First Amendment, so it's a bad combination of the two. How does this all apply to this? Well, I think this is pretty clearly on the government speech side of the line, right? The executive order is not saying, OpenAI, if you want to sell us something, you have to change how you do other kinds of speech. You're allowed to sell woke GPT to anyone you want. So this really is purely a government procurement question, and I really think the government is allowed to pick whatever model, frankly, it wants, because the government is allowed to have a view of what is the most useful model for its own purposes. I think when you then combine that fairly strong principle with how relatively reasonable, again, we should actually get into the details of this, but how relatively reasonable the executive order is if you ignore Section 1, truth-seeking, ideological neutrality, then there are all these carve-outs. I just think it's very hard, frankly, for anyone to challenge this, not to mention the fact that no one's going to challenge this, I think, because, probably don't, if you're a big AI company, you probably don't want to sue the government that you want to sell a $500 billion AI system contract to.
And I want to get to who's actually impacted by this and who may stand to kind of gain even from it. But Renee, any color to add there with respect to the First Amendment ramifications?
No, I was curious about the transparency arguments. Again, there's some in the United States in particular. Compelled transparency has been a fight that we have seen around. In the content moderation realm and in social media realms around algorithmic transparency, to what extent recommender systems have to disclose what they do. This has been a vicious fight here in the US. We've seen nothing pass. One of the interesting dynamics here is that the EU does have those laws, right? And I've been curious to see whether we'll see again that transparency requirements around, the EU AI Act has things like model card requirements and certain types of aspects if they're systems that either engage in high risk type, AI in high risk spaces, meaning like financial AI or health related AI, so not generative AI, a little bit of more predictive models. But then they also do have certain disclosure rules for generative AI, and I've been curious to see whether we'll see more transparency requirements emerge over there that then have sort of second order effects over here, or if we'll see some of the transparency around system prompts be something that happens just through shaming, or if that's something that does eventually move through more of a regulatory regime.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So the transparency stuff. So the relevant case here is this case called Zouderer, and this is about when disclosure requirements in commercial contexts are permitted under the First Amendment, because on the one hand, the First Amendment is very skeptical of what's sometimes called compelled speech. On the other hand, on the commercial speech doctrine, commercial speech is often given less first amendment protections. And so there's this case called Zouderer. It came up a little bit in like the net choice cases a year or two ago. And I don't have the exact doctrinal statement kind of off the top of my head, but basically it allows for compelled disclosure in a commercial context when that disclosure like serves some reasonable interest and it is factual and uncontroversial, right? So this is, for example, why food manufacturers can be compelled to disclose ingredients and nutrition facts, or, for example, why drug manufacturers can be compelled to disclose all sorts of health risks of their drugs. So at the same time, there are limits to this, right? For example, there have been cases where tobacco manufacturers have successfully fought against very graphic, this is your long on tobacco kind of, imagery on the basis that that's no longer factual and uncontroversial. Now you're basically forcing a company to make an argument with which it disagrees. So again, like there's like a million details here. So the question is, could you challenge this under a case like Zouderer, this disclosure? I think no, for two reasons. One is it's not a freestanding transparency requirement. It is part of a procurement, and I think you can very reasonably argue that like if I want to buy something, I need to be able to, the federal government, need to be able to make a informed choice about what it is that I'm buying, and so I need to know the system prompt. That seems like totally reasonable. And then also, even if this was a freestanding requirement, even if, for example, Congress passed, the System Prompt Disclosure Act, which would be interesting, that I think is quite factual and factual and uncontroversial, right? That's different than what some, for example, state laws have proposed, which would be a little more, I think, problematic, of requiring model developers to disclose safety risks, right? Because that's much more speculative. This is no, I want like whatever string of text is appended to my user input when it's sent to the model. I would like to know what that string of text is. We can argue about the policy merits of that, but I think on like constitutional grounds, that's probably kosher.
So Renee, looking at the broader ramifications of this sort of procurement-based AI shaping legislation or executive order, are we going to see this at the state level? Are we going to see 50 different approaches of each governor saying, I'm only going to procure a AI model that aligns with the values of all North Carolinians? Or how might we see this develop over time?
I mean, we could. I think that the top half of this was sort of a culture war nod, as opposed to something that is really a strong, a strong use case. I mean, again, I think that the second half of it is just laying out where it just gives them a justification and to do something that they wanted to do anyway. So I don't know that it's going to be something that we're going to see all 50 states replicate. I don't think that we have seen much in the way of the culture warification in AI procurement at the state level. I don't think I have. Maybe other people have. We've certainly seen folks like, Attorney General of Missouri, maybe Alan, you want to take that one on, come out and try to demand documents and training data from AI companies because, for example, President Trump wasn't rated as the #1 most pro-Jewish or anti-Semitic president in model results returned by, I think it was OpenAI that he got offended about. But I don't think we have seen as many instances of the culture warification of AI happen at the state level. So I would be a little bit surprised to see that start to happen now. But, who knows? There are certain states that feel a need to prove themselves in this regard.
And how do we see this as a sort of broader example of where we may see federal legislation going in the coming months? I mean, we saw, for example, that this concern about some of the cultural ramifications of AI adoption by kids in particular with respect to AI companions may have been one of the, if not the determinative factor in Senator Blackburn, for example, eventually opposing the AI moratorium. How do you see this influencing some of the broader debates around content moderation and value shaping in the AI context?
I think on the legislative front, the safety conversation is very much part of the the kind of kids and safety dynamic, both in content moderation, in search results, and what is returned, in how AI agents engage with children. All of that has been part of the conversation for some time now. I don't think, I think that the woke AI piece gets pulled into it in the conversation of what are the values that we want these systems to return when our children engage with them. Again, I would maybe I'm a little bit cynical at this point. I don't know that we've seen anything really material move through Congress on this front. So I don't know if Alan disagrees with me here. I think that it'll be incorporated in. I don't know that it's necessarily going to be meaningful in getting anything passed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that this is done through procurement just changes a lot. It just takes a lot of the, for example, legal issues off the table. Because any attempt, Renee mentioned the sort of Andrew Ferguson stuff. I mean, any attempt to interfere in the actual substantive content of the models themselves raises huge First Amendment issues. Again, those aren't always sometimes those are defeasible, right? I think especially in the child protection context, especially in the wake of the Paxton Supreme Court decision of last term. So I think the procurement context makes this a lot easier, which is, I suspect, why they did it this way. Also, it's unilateral executive branch action. Trying to cobble together Congress on AI is going to be very hard, as we saw, for example, with the moratorium. I think that what's going to be more impactful is if this works, which is to say, if in 120 days OMB sets out implementing regulations and the companies comply with it and they show that they can be ideologically neutral and truth-seeking, then that's going to be an interesting question, because then the rest of us are going to be like, well, where's my, like, why does only the government get ideologically neutral and truth-seeking AI? I want ideologically neutral and truth-seeking AI. And we should talk about, what that would even mean. On the other hand, if this all crashes and burns and it just turns out that there's no way, that's all technically infeasible, the national security carve-out is used for everything, and the AI companies simply disclose the system prompt and don't change anything, then this whole thing will have been largely irrelevant. And I think both of those options are totally plausible.
Well, so to focus in on that Section 3 requirement with respect to ideological neutrality, Alan, what does this actually mean in the context of the EO, and what's the sort of steelman for why this might actually be a sort of policy that a lot of Americans may say, this actually makes a lot of sense. All else equal, I would love the government to procure an ideological neutral GPT.
Yeah. Well, first, can I just say something about the truth-seeking, the truth-seeking requirement? I think this is an interesting one, and I think a generally pretty good one, right? So this requirement says, and I'll just read it because it's short, LLM shall be truthful in responding to user prompts seeking factual information or analysis. LLM shall prioritize historical accuracy, scientific inquiry, and objectivity, and shall acknowledge uncertainty where reliable information is incomplete or contradictory. I might remove objectivity. That's like a loaded, that's, philosophers of science and epistemologists have spent hundreds of years trying to figure out what that word means. And, many dissertations have been written unsuccessfully trying to fight that fight. So I might remove that word. But I think for the rest of it, that's a pretty good sentence, actually. Obviously, there are some technical impediments there. LLMs hallucinate. But, I do think encouraging companies to design their systems to be somewhat epistemically humble and to put error bounds around what they're saying and try to be a little more reflective around when they might be hallucinating. So I think these are all pretty good things. I'm sort of curious if Renee sees any landmines in that definition. But I do want to just take a moment on that, because I think that is a useful contribution to the discourse.
There are a few different academic centers that are trying to study this question of how politically neutral or how politically biased, to frame it a different way, various GPTs are. There's some arguments people have made that you could do, the same way you ask various alignment-related questions. You can create sort of scoring around, surfacing political or ideological bias, the same way like media bias fact check might come up with scores, or NewsGuard might come up with scores for media outlets. You could do something like this where it just surfaces biases that or preferences, whatever you want to call them, that pop up in models. I think Stanford HAI has some work that they've done on this. I know in Germany there's a Karlsruhe, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that, Institute of Technology that has done some things. I think Santa Fe Institute has a project on this. There's a bunch of different, and the findings kind of, they just surface alignment with particular party positions, ways in which, and these things talk about certain policies, ways that they talk about, climate change. And one of the challenges that you have, though, is that there's this thing that this sort of common phrase, this like reality has a left-leaning bias, like with climate change in particular, right? Where do you draw the line? How do you talk about bias in certain topical areas? Like vaccines don't cause autism, guys, right? And what do you? But there's a vast number of people on the right who have been misled into believing that they do. And so how do you surface what is what models articulate about particular things? This, again, just to return to the Grok drama, one of the issues that Elon had with Grok was that as people moved into using @Grok, is this true, became a way that users were doing almost fact checks of content that they saw on X as they began to ask Grok. Because remember, X, it nuked its professional fact checking program. Community Notes, while a wonderful generic initiative, takes like 14 hours for a note to appear, if it appears at all. It's very, very slow. And so people began to use @Grok, is this true, as a means of trying to get validation. And then, of course, sometimes Grok says, yes, humans do play a role in climate change, and this would enrage some percentage of the audience. And on certain types of more culture war issue topics, that led Elon to say, Grok has been badly trained. It pays too much attention to certain types of sources. We're going to fix that. And now if you look at how that Grok agent interacts, it has shifted significantly ways in which it talks about certain high-profile topics. So the bias has tilted, where it might have been actually fairly truth-seeking and neutral, but again, based on treating mainstream sources in scientific journals as authoritative sources, now it has been weighted in a very different direction. So that question of what kinds of scoring and how do you design the tests that surface these things, that itself is kind of a fraught question. But this is an area of research where people are trying to create visibility into ways in which models surface content. The same way we used to say in social media land, there's no such thing as a neutral recommender system. There's no such thing as a neutrally ranked feed. There is some value baked in. So surfacing that transparently is probably the best the best option that you have for at least making the public aware of what they are using and how, as opposed to trying to pretend that there is some true neutral.
Yeah, and I think this begs questions around some of the other inputs to AI model development, like where you're getting your training data is obviously going to have huge ramifications for what truth looks like, or what truth may appear to look like from whatever that model output is. So also worth noting that the AI action plan itself calls for some of this mechanistic interpretability and explainability that may actually assist with some of these evals into whether or not a model is truth-seeking or seeking of the truth, however it ends up being defined. But we also haven't touched quite yet on the idea of ideological neutrality. So, Alan, do you want to circle back to that?
Yeah. So this is the tricky one, I think. First, squinting at the text, I mean, you can read it a lot of different ways, right? It actually does talk about DEI as like a big boogeyman, though again, it doesn't define it, which I think is interesting. But it also does not say that they have to be neutral. It says that the tools, quote, do not manipulate responses in favor of ideological dogmas, and that developers shall not, quote, intentionally encode partisan or ideological judgments, right? And even there, it allows that if the, quote, judgments are prompted by or otherwise readily accessible to the end user. And so I think what that is recognizing, again, is the fact that there is no such thing as a quote-unquote non-ideological response, right? At a highest level, ideology is just one's worldview. And these models do have a worldview. And they have a worldview because humanity has a worldview. And these models are trained on humanity's corpus of output. And so, I don't want to get like too sort of philosophical, but unfortunately, this question is actually deeply philosophical. It's very important to distinguish between ideological neutrality, I think, in two senses. One sense is, I think, what people think of as ideologically neutral, which is a kind of procedural liberalism that tries to be generally tolerant and generally open-minded, right? And that's not ideologically neutral in the strict sense, because there are things that it's not ideologically neutral about. If, for example, it is not ideologically neutral about intolerance, right? It has certain like substantive commitments to it. But it sort of encodes this idea that in a liberal society, you want to have like a pretty wide Overton window, all things considered. And like, if that's all that this is saying, I think that's fine, right? That's not to say that every model should be like that, right? I mean, if you want woke GPT or you want based GPT, like you should be able to buy that. But of course, we're talking about this in a government procurement sense. And I think it's not unreasonable in a liberal democracy for the government to use a model that is liberal and ideologically neutral in that sense. The thing is, no one should think that that's ideologically neutral in the strict sense, right? And what worries me, and this is to Renee's point that you made right now, one could read this and one could listen to the discourse about this and think that there is a technical neutral option here, right? And that does not exist. And so, shortly after the woke Gemini debacle, I, along with James Grumman and Blake Reed, who are two great legal academics, wrote this piece saying, look, woke Gemini was ridiculous because it was a bad model that disserved its users and gave them stuff that like users definitely don't want. But the problem wasn't that it was not neutral. The problem was that it was a stupid model, right? And so I think that ideological neutrality is, in the kind of soft sense, definitely something that probably we want, and something that clearly the model developers also want, because they also don't want to jam a particularly divisive ideology down their users' throats, because that's not what most users want. But let's not pretend that this is ideological neutrality in the sort of deeper sense. And I just really don't want people to misunderstand that is technically feasible, because it is not technically feasible, because literally in some deep sense, like thousands of years of political theory and like moral reasoning and moral philosophizing have been trying to figure out like the ground of, normative neutrality, and like they haven't succeeded, and they won't, because it doesn't exist.
No, I think, again, I would just say that the absolute neutrality idea, you're not going to have it. So it's just having that visibility and that transparency into system prompts and things, and letting people see what they have available to them and what they can choose from is the best the best possible remedy, if you will.
And to close, there's been some argument that Grok in particular and XAI stands to benefit most because it's already reached some contracts, some agreements with the federal government itself. Alan, Renee, any hot takes on which lab is the biggest winner, so to speak, in this new reality?
Well, yeah, I'll run.
No, go ahead. I'm curious because, there's also the sheer pettiness of this administration that I think we can't discount.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, Grok looked like a big winner a few months ago, and now Elon is on the outs. So right? I don't know, right? Maybe Grok is a winner. Like it's a good model. I mean, like the Mecha Hitler stuff is stupid, but like whatever, it's
but
stupid
Zuckerberg's
in the way that
in the tent. Zuckerberg is in the tent, and he
Sam Altman
bought his way into the tent, And the I don't know that Sam. I don't
no,
think
but
Sam really kissed the ring.
No, I think
much,
with Starbird, Starfield, whatever it's called. What is the Stargate? Thank you.
Okay.
Right? I mean, he gave Trump a big win. So, I think right now it is still a pretty open field. And then I also wouldn't undercount the. I also just wouldn't count the power of bureaucratic procurement inertia, right? Like, if some agency is operating on the Microsoft Azure cloud or they have a Google Cloud account, like, whatever the wokeness or baseness of the relevant model is, it's just going to be a lot easier to extend that particular contract.
Is Clippy woke? debate. We'll save that for the
Is
audience.
Clippy woke or based? That's a good, answer in the comments.
Answer in the comments. Thumbs up for Clippy being woke. Anyways, Renee, Alan, thank you so much for joining. It's been a hoot as always, and looking forward to having you both back soon, and Alan, making you come to this side of the hosting table.